to start with the concept of life. What is life before we demystify death? When we think about life, when you say somebody is alive, somebody is well, someone is full of life, what does that mean? They're full of energy, they're full of passion, they're vivacious, they give off a certain spirit. And as we're talking about that, I would like to mention, and this is not an afterthought, but actually Rabbi Cohen had sent out an email today, letting everybody know that we're dedicating the first class to the merit of the soul of a very vivacious, energetic, joyful person who was in our midst for many years, not enough years, but many years, and would come to Charlotte every year for the month of Tishrei, including the high holidays, through Simchas Torah, and then for Pesach. He was the cantor at the Ballantyne Jewish Center, and of course, the son-in-law of the Spangenthals, and that is Chaim Shner Zalman Yehuda ben Aaron Leib Dukes, known as Yudi Dukes. And Yudi was torn away from us less than 2 weeks ago at the tender age of 39. And here you have the story of someone that was very vivacious, full of energy, wanted to live, had a lot to accomplish, and yet his soul journeyed on from this world to the next. One of his passions was, or one of his main passions was the idea of the study of Torah and to delve into the issues of Torah. He was the leader of JNet, which is an organization that partners people one-on-one for Torah study, free of cost, free of, it's not a charge for it, just for the opportunity to study. So I figured that when we're meeting tonight, talking about a sensitive issue like the journey of the soul, that we should dedicate it to his soul, and it'll hopefully inspire us and give him the lift that he needs. So now let's go into this idea of life and the opposite of life. When we talk about death, death is something which preoccupies people up to a point, depending on what level we are. Most people don't think about death every day. Most people think about the day-to-day obligations that we have in life, the day-to-day chores that we have to take care of. When do we have to go shopping? When do we have to go to work? Do I have to fill my car up with gas? However, when we're confronted with a situation of death, that causes us to stop and to try to become introspective and to think, what does death mean? What is the meaning of death? And what is the Jewish view on death? This year in particular, when I say this year, I mean since last year, February, March, up until now, we have had a heightened awareness of the possibility of death because of the COVID pandemic. And many of us were affected by it, including myself with the passing of my father in April due to COVID. And it causes us to think about our mortality. And when we talk about death, I want to mention one other thing, because people also, when we lose someone, so of course there's the sadness, there's the grief, there is the mourning, but then there is also something which is called survivor's guilt, especially if a person passed away and they were relatively healthy and it came out of nowhere, like a pandemic or, God forbid, a car accident or some other illness. So there's a bit of survivor's guilt. Sometimes there is a regret that we didn't do enough. There was so much that we could have done together. And did I want to do everything I wanted to do with this person? Did I say everything that I wanted to say? And we begin to think about it. And then we ask the question, can we communicate with the person? Does Judaism believe that we should go to the cemetery and visit the grave? And if we're visiting the grave, is it just to satisfy our need? Is it just to comfort ourselves? Does the soul of the departed actually hear us, feel our presence or not? These are kinds of questions that we ask for ourselves. And then there's the question about what happens to the soul once the soul departed. Is the soul comfortable or not? We want to send a telegram to the soul and say, we care about you, we love you, and try to do whatever we can to make sure that the soul is in a happy place. So these are questions that actually plague many of the people, and they look for the answers. And hopefully, those of you that are participating in this course, starting from tonight and going on to the 6 lessons, will find answers to all these questions. Now, I'm just going to wait for Rabbi Cohen to come back in because I want to push this to the next level. So when it comes to this issue of the journey of the soul, there's the practical side, there's the philosophical side, and there's the emotional side. The practical side is how do we deal with it? The emotional side is how do we grieve? The philosophical side is just to be able to have the knowledge of what actually is taking place. Rabbi Cohen, Shloimeh, I'm going to have him to help me. Thank you. We humans are gifted with self-awareness. We're constantly aware of our mortality. So therefore, it causes us to think about it. Yet you will find that there are some people that their whole issue is that they think and they believe that life is dictated by death. There is a movement that actually is called TMT. And this TMT means that it translates as terror management theory, because they're constantly worried about death, and they've come up with all kinds of controversial theories about it, as I will explain. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is, if you have your book, to please open up the book to text number 1 and see what it says here when we speak about a universal fear. Mortality has haunted us from the beginning of history. 4,000 years ago, the Babylonian hero Gilgamesh reflected on the death of his friend Enkidu with the words, "Thou hast become dark and cannot hear me. When I die, I shall not be like Enkidu. Sorrow enters my heart. I am afraid of death." Gilgamesh speaks for all of us. As he feared death, so do we all. Each and every man, woman, and child. For some of us, the fear of death manifests only indirectly, either as a generalized unrest or masqueraded as another psychological symptom. Other individuals experience an explicit and conscious stream of anxiety about death. And for some of us, the fear of death erupts into terror that negates all happiness and fulfillment. Now, of course, this is just the opinion of one psychologist, but nevertheless, there is a big following of people that believe in that. And they believe that people are obsessed with it. And because they're overwhelmed by it, they don't have a way how to deal with it. And because they don't have a way how to deal with it, so they basically ignore it and they take it out of mind. And they say, we just cannot focus on it. Only when we have to, we're going to live as long as we can live. Others, on the other hand, are more reflective of it. But the question really is, how do we view it in Judaism? And how does it reflect on our everyday life? I can't get the slides to move. I was taking care of somebody outside. Stay. Let's see here. I just clicked here.
Looks good.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So we're going to move right along with this to try to get into the Jewish viewpoint. Now, one of the things that the psychologists say is that religion has figured out a very easy answer in how to deal with the fear of death, or the question of death, or the question of what happens after life. And all the religions are sort of coupled together. And on the surface, it may seem that what Judaism has to say mirrors and parallels a lot of what other religions have to say. But we're actually going to delve into it and see that Judaism is very unique. This is not to knock anyone else's philosophy, but it's to look at the uniqueness of Judaism. And with this, we're going to be examining a lot of other questions that people usually have. A lot of questions that I usually get is, does Judaism believe in heaven and hell? Another question that I get is, does Judaism believe in reincarnation? Another question I get is, don't Jews just celebrate life and we don't think about death? Live it up as much as you can. Of course, be kind, be ethical, be good. But death is not something that our religion thinks about. There are other religions that constantly think about the world to come. And to them, this is just like a corridor where they're passing through from here to the next one. So all of that is in the mix. And hopefully, as we go through these 6 weeks, we will actually be able to tackle these in the right way. Here's one other thing that I want to say before we delve into the text, and this is very, very important for all of you to understand. When you structure something in Judaism, the answer is never a simple yes or no answer. Not because it isn't yes or no, because the yes is not a yes alone. You're going to ask a question about a car. Does this car drive forward and backwards? And you'll answer yes. Okay, now I know what a car is. A car basically can go forward and backward, but it really doesn't reveal what the car is, the complexity of the technology that goes into a car. In order for us to be able to establish the Jewish view on life and what comes after life, we have to be able to freeze frame the ideas and go from step to step, because you can't jump over one step and go into the next one before we understand what it really is. So our first thing that we have to do is try to understand the uniqueness of life, the uniqueness of the soul. And when we do that, it's going to be in a very focused way. And if you cut the tape right there, you'll think, okay, I got it. And it doesn't work that way, because you have to look at the converse side as well, the other side, to see the flip side. And then you have to come to the final conclusion of it. So let's start here. When we speak about life and death and what's now and what's later, the first question that we have to ask is, who are we and what are we? When we think about life, you think about yourself. When you think about yourself, are you going to say that am I intelligent? I hope I am. But does that define me? Am I emotional and compassionate? Does that define me? Is it my physical body that defines me? What is it that is me? And as I said before, most people don't think about these issues day to day because you are in the mad rush to just make sense of life. But there are times that you stop and you say, what am I? Now, the problem over here is, and I'm not saying because I'm the challenge is that usually when you want to know what something is, let's say a scientist wants to understand the virus. So they look under the microscope and they look at the effects and they try to figure out what all kinds of cells that make up the virus and the variants of the virus. When you're dealing with something of spiritual kind of existence, it doesn't work that way. It actually works in a totally different way. And I will explain in a minute. So first, let's give a look from the Kabbalistic sense, because Kabbalah deals with the spirit and the beyond, to see how the Kabbalah reviews this. And let me just say, there's a very famous writer of Kabbalah by the name of Rabbi Chaim Vital, who was given the official permission to record the teachings of the Arizal, the Lurianic Kabbalistic thinking, which is an authentic source of Kabbalah that is studied worldwide. And to try to understand the depth of Kabbalah, one has to know the Lurianic Kabbalah. So we're going to look at text 2. This is taken from Rabbi Chaim Vital, Shari Akdusha, and he writes the following. I'm going to read it in English so that we can all understand. I don't have to translate it. The wise are aware that the human body is not the human being. When we speak of the human being, we are referring to the human's inner dimensions. The body is merely a garment in which the soul is attired during its sojourn in the world. Okay, so what is he saying here? He's saying here the body is just a garment. The body is something which is an instrument through which the soul reveals itself into the world. But the human being is not the body, the human being is the soul. So just to look at the slide here, who am I? I am not my body. It's not my knowledge and intellect and emotions and desires. I am my soul. That's who I am. It's my soul. Okay, now that we say that I am my soul, what is a soul? Where does the soul come from? And how does it function? But before we go there, when we talk about body and soul, the concept of body and soul has expressed itself in many different dimensions. If you want to use examples, we can use any kind of example. There's one example of the musical instrument, which is the body, and the music that flows out of it is the soul. I like to use the idea of words. Words are a body. When you're writing words or speaking words, you're using letters to combine them together and to create sentences. That's the body. The concept that's contained within the words, that's the soul. So the concept is always there, but the only way that the concept can reveal itself into our thought or in our speech, in the way we're communicating it to someone else, has to come through a body. So therefore it's called a body. But the body is actually not the important thing. The important thing is the soul. And where do we see this? We see this when you compare thought to speech. So when you are speaking, you're thinking about the words that you are communicating. You want to make sure you're using the proper sentence, the proper grammar, the proper words to articulate the concept. Now, if you're good at it, you don't even feel the words. But every person who is thinking about these words, you're actually not feeling the words. You're feeling the concept. You're not recognizing or sensing the words, even though the words, the thoughts, the words, the way they appear in your mind, need to have the words, because otherwise they don't make sense to you. That's why sometimes if you speak multiple languages and you're fluent in all of them, you can stop for a moment and say, by the way, what language am I thinking in? Am I thinking in Hebrew? Am I thinking in Yiddish? Am I thinking in English? Am I thinking in Flemish? Am I thinking in Afrikaans or in Russian or in Spanish? So the very fact that you can think that way and say, what language am I thinking in? That in itself is proof that you're using words. Those words is what we call the body. If you compare the relationship of the body to the soul, the body is merely a garment through which the soul can express itself, but it has no entity of its own. You have no use for it on your own. The main thing is the soul. And this is the meaning of this Kabbalistic teaching that Rabbi Chaim Vital is saying in the name of the Arizal, that the body is basically the conduit through which the soul comes into this world. What's the uniqueness of the soul? So there's a uniqueness in the human soul. And if you give a look at the slide, it says God formed the human of soil from the earth and breathed into his nostrils the neshama of life, the soul of life. When it comes to animals, God said, let the earth bring forth all kinds of living beings. What's the difference between the two statements? When it comes to the human, the body was formed from the earth as one entity, and the soul was inserted in the body. God breathed into the body a soul. Whereas when it comes to the animal, the life force and body were created together. What does this mean? This means to say that the soul preceded and lived before the body. It's not that the soul came into existence at the time of the body. And by the way, this doesn't address the question of what came first, or when is the time when life begins. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the comparison of the soul to the body. The soul is an entity that was created at the time of creation, and God appoints at a time when it has to go into the body, as we're going to see a reading very soon. So there's a commentary in 3C that I want you to look at on page 7, which is the Chizkuni. The Chizkuni was a very famous rabbi that wrote text. He was a French rabbi that wrote text on the Torah, commentary on the Torah, and he writes the following: God did what he had not done with any other creature. He blew into Adam, that's Adam and Eve, with his Holy Spirit and his Neshama that is immortal and does not perish when the body does. So what we're saying now is that the real I is the soul, and it's not the body. So therefore, when a person is born, it basically means that the soul enters into the body. And when the person dies, the soul leaves from the body. But it doesn't affect the life of the body. Almost as if you're saying that the body is like a stranger on foreign soil. What does that mean? It means to say that the body is something which is so separate from the soul that the soul, just because of God's decision, it has to live in the body, therefore it lives in the body. So if the real me is my soul and not my body, so then the soul is eternal and I am eternal. Now, that is the religious answer that we usually give in regards to death, that death doesn't cause the soul to cease to exist. The soul continues to exist just like it wasn't dependent on the body to exist beforehand. So it doesn't depend on the body's death or the end of the body, the end of the lifetime of the body to actually live. There's dramatic reading from the Midrash. And remember, when we read the Midrash, we have to put it into context. But the reason we want to read the Midrash is because there is something even deeper here, according to this philosophy. And that is that the soul resists descending. The soul resists. The soul doesn't want to descend into the body. We're going to see a statement later from Ethics of Our Fathers where it says that it's against your will that you're born. But it also says it's against your will that you die. So we'll explain that in a minute. But this concept that the soul descends into the body means to say that the soul lives in some superior chamber in heaven, and it's basking in the glory of the divine, and it understands it, it feels it, and it's very spiritual, it's very godly, and all of a sudden it's taken out of that element and forced into exile into a human body with human desires and human needs. And in fact, the way the Medrash says it is quite explicit, and it's difficult to receive, but I still think it's necessary to read it to see the Jewish perspective. So it says, 40 days before the conception of a child, God summons the angel in charge of souls and tells him, bring before me a certain soul that is now in paradise. Its name is such and such, and its appearance is such and such. Obviously, it's a spiritual appearance. This is possible because all the souls that are born into this world were created on the day that the world was created and exist until the end of time. In other words, the souls were not created at the time of birth. The souls exist from the time of creation, and they're in this chamber. The angel goes and brings the soul before God. The soul bows and prostrates itself before the Supreme King of Kings. God instructs the soul, please enter the seminal drop that is currently in the hands of the angel in charge of pregnancy. The soul protests, Master of the universe, I am quite satisfied with the world I inhabited since the day you created me. I am holy and pure, hewn from your throne of glory. Why do you wish to cause me to enter into this putrid drop? So in other words, what the Midrash here is trying to demonstrate to us is that the soul is not happy that it has to come down into the body, which again proves that the body is something foreign to the soul. So therefore, when the person dies, the soul now goes up and basks again in heaven. And the soul is not unhappy. The soul is happy according to this interpretation. Furthermore, if you give a look in the next text on page 10, in text 5, which is taken from Ethics of Our Fathers, it says, this world is like a corridor before the world to come. Prepare yourself in the corridor so that you may enter the palace. In other words, that your whole life of living on this world is for the coming world. That's a very common phrase in a lot of other religions. And you see that here in Judaism as well. And then it goes on to say that a single moment of bliss in this world to come is greater than all of this world. In other words, if you take all the pleasures that you could imagine that you would have in this world, the most spiritual, the most refined, esoteric kind of pleasures, of course, we're not talking about physical pleasures, but even physical pleasures, and you combine it all together. So it says that 1 hour of the pleasure and the delight that the soul has in the world to come is greater than all the pleasures combined that you can have in this world, which means to say that it's incomparable what the soul will gain. So basically, according to this, the real me is not my body, but my soul. The real me is the soul, which is eternal, so I'm eternal. So the real me, in other words, I'm not talking from the psychological level of the real me, finding out who I am and people that have an identity crisis. I'm talking about the soul. The real me, which is the soul, is unaffected by birth or by death. This is the way most people see the religious viewpoint, and see, if you examine the Jewish viewpoint, you see this as well. However, anyone that studies a little bit more of Judaism knows that there's a flip side. And as I told you before, that when you learn something in Judaism, there's no such thing as a yes or no answer. You have to see it from all sides. So we definitely accept that the soul is very important. We definitely accept that someone who emphasizes their body and is always thinking about the body sensations and the bodily ideas are missing out on the real aspect of life. True. However, the question here is, if that's the case, then Judaism basically agrees to all these other religions that this whole life is not the real life. The real life is the real life, the world to come. And that goes against everything that we were taught. Furthermore, we know that Judaism is a culture of life. We'll give you a few examples to that in a few moments. So the question is, which one is it? And let's first set up the case here to show you how Judaism views life on earth as being something which is very important. There's a famous writing from the Radvaz, who lived in the 16th century in Morocco and in Egypt. And he wrote about the laws of Avelut, the laws of mourning, which we're going to be discussing in the future classes, understanding why we say Kaddish and how we mourn and why we have Shiva and why we have the Shloshim. Today is just like an introduction to the whole general area. But he says over there that on the one hand, Judaism doesn't allow excessive mourning. So the Torah prohibits us from tearing out our hair, or some people that would cut into their flesh to show the agony. But then Judaism does have laws of mourning when the soul passes away. In fact, one of the things that we have to do is tear our garment. And by the way, just as a little statement, why I personally don't do the black ribbon that some people do is because I feel that the black ribbon is a very poor substitute for what's going on. And when somebody tears their garment, when they are in pain for the loss of a loved one, they feel as if their heart is actually torn. And I can speak from my personal experience. And I mean, I've done it for so many people, but then when I had to do it for myself, I felt it, and I felt that anything else is artificial. So yet in Judaism, you have that concept of mourning. And not only that, the Radvaz writes that there were certain Arab tribes and Muslims that would prohibit any kind of mourning, because they said, since the main life is the life of the soul in the future, so you should celebrate that the life passed away, because now he's going into the eternal. and life in this world is meaningless. And we should be happy that the soul now has come to the highest level. And that's a very, in Judaism, that's a very, it's a very dangerous attitude, because then it reduces the value of life. And we know that in Judaism, the value of life is the most important value. The entire Torah, except 3 things, are suspended in order to preserve life. So he writes over there that he would be opposed to that. You have to have a balanced view, a balanced way. But from the very fact that there is the mourning, that in itself tells you that preservation of life is paramount. Not only that, according to Torah, if you have a challenging situation and someone says, I want you to violate the Torah, I want you to eat pork, or I want you to do this desecration of Shabbat, and if you don't do that, I'm going to kill you. What's the halacha? What's the law? Let's give a look inside, page 12, text 6 from the Rambam, Mishnah Torah. When a non-Jew, this is when a non-Jew would oppress the Jewish people, and they would attempt to force a Jew to violate one of the Torah's commandments at the pain of death, the Jew should violate the commandment rather than be killed, because the Torah states concerning the mitzvot, a person shall do them to live by them. One should live by them and not die because of them. For that reason, when you have a patient, for instance, that's in danger and is suffering a life-threatening illness, so then you have to suspend everything in the Torah in order to preserve the life. There are 3 exceptions, and those 3 exceptions are not because there's a logical reason, it's because God commanded it. So idolatry is one of them that one has to give their life for, not to worship other idols. Adultery is another one, and murder. That if someone says, if you don't kill this person, I'll kill you, you have to let yourself be killed. But those are the 3. All the others, if one causes themselves to die so that they shouldn't violate the Torah, that in itself is a violation. There are exceptions, and I don't want to dwell on this, but the Rambam Maimonides himself says that at the time of Gzeira, the time of decree, when every mitzvah that they want that the Jews should violate and desecrate and transgress is to prove that they don't believe in God, so then everything becomes as if it's worshiping idol. And that was the story that happened during Hanukkah. But generally speaking, what we find here is that the preservation of life is most important. And how does this jive with what we said before? When we said before that the whole concept of life is the soul, and the body is just like a tag along, and the body is really secondary and has no meaning. So then if Torah is so important, and worshiping God is so important, and fulfilling God's commandments is so important, so then why would you not give your life in order to be able to have the bliss of the world to come? And yet Judaism says the opposite. Not only that, in that same midrash that we learned before, when the soul comes along and he says to God, why are you punishing me and shipping me down to this putrid seed that I would have to now live this physical life that's so unbecoming to my spiritual holiness and purity that I enjoy? What does God answer him? So give a look again on page 13, text 7. God hurries to reassure the descending soul, the world to which I am bringing you will prove more beneficial than the one you presently inhabit. Indeed, I formed you exclusively for the purpose of creating mortal life from this particular drop of seed. With that, God forcibly installs the soul. This is a very important statement, and we're actually going to buffer it up with the next one. If you remember before, we said that if you take all the pleasures of this world and you combine it together, it doesn't match even 1 hour of the delight and the pleasure that the soul has in the world to come. But there's a follow-up to that, and that follow-up is in text 8. And that is that a single moment of repentance and good deeds in this world is greater than all the world to come. So what do we see from here? We see from here that number one, Judaism values life. Preservation of life precedes almost all the mitzvahs. This world is more precious than the world to come. So what does it mean? Actually, the answer to this is actually found at the end of text 7, because God says, indeed, I formed you exclusively for the purpose of creating mortal life. In other words, not only did I create you, but I created the entire world with all of that is connected, everything that's in it, for the sake of the soul descending onto earth. What does this mean? It means the following. If you think about the world to come. So we're saying the world to come is a very spiritual place, and it's called paradise, or the Garden of Eden. The reason that it's called Garden of Eden, because Eden in Hebrew means delight. And the place, the garden, is a garden of delight. It's not only just a place of delight, but it's a garden of delight. There's tranquility for the soul. The soul comes to the highest level, and angels dwell there. The higher celestial beings are there. It goes all the way up to the top until it comes close to God, which is basking in the light of God. And what the Torah is saying is that all of that was created for only one purpose, that the soul should descend into the body. And if the soul does not descend into the body, then there's no purpose for this creation. That's a very strong statement. So we're not discussing yet why God wanted it. That's a separate discussion. And that's something which we will talk eventually, why the entire intent is in the physical world and in the physical body, and why the physical body is so special. But what we do know is that that's the intent of creation. So if you think about, it's hard to describe, but when you study Kabbalah, you study Zohar, and you think about the myriads of worlds that exceed any kind of mental imagination that we could have. And it contains all kinds of angels and all kinds of holy sparks and all kinds of souls, born and unborn. And it goes on for miles and miles, if we can say. And you're saying that all of that and everything that's going on there was only created for the sake of the soul living on earth. So now we begin to realize that living on earth is not just a passageway, even though it says that it's like a hallway or a vestibule. Of course, it means something much more, and we're going to get to that. But it means that there is also, not only also, but there's a tremendous emphasis on living on earth and doing what you can while you are in the body. And that's the reason that when the body, that's the reason when the body dies, there's all this mourning and grief. Because why? Because the purpose has now changed. The Torah goes on a little further with that, because there's a statement in the Talmud in text 9 that even expresses it more. It says, God created the universe on a condition: if the Jews accept the Torah, he told the universe, you will continue to exist. In other words, if they accept the Torah. If they don't, then you will return to nothingness. What does this mean? What does it mean, return to nothingness? How did God create the world? God created the world by saying the statements, let there be light, let there be the firmament. And these words are constantly sustaining the world. There's a divine energy that flows from God, sustaining, creating and sustaining everything in the universe. And it's there for a purpose. And the purpose is that we should do the Torah mitzvahs in the physical sense, not in the spiritual sense, but in the physical sense. And the Torah says here that if the Jews are not going to accept that, then it reverts back to the way it was before. No world. It's not just that the world is destroyed. It means that the world doesn't exist, period, as if it never existed. That the whole purpose of the existence is for us, our lifetime in the body, that's where it all counts. This is what we call ground zero. Imagine if you're preparing a wedding. A groom and a bride are preparing a wedding. And they plan years for it, and they plan exactly where it's going to be and what kind of mansion it's going to be in, and all the decorations, and the bands and the photographer, and they choreograph it that it should be exactly right. And it's a whole big occupation. It takes 2 years to plan this, and they have this whole big operation that's going to take place. And God forbid, a month before or 2 months before, they break up and they decide not to get married. So what happens then with all of the musicians, with all the photographers, with all of the decorators and with all the caterers and everything else, which until now you were oohing and eyeing at the kind of food you're going to have, you're oohing and eyeing at the kind of decorations, now they become meaningless. Even though they're beautiful, but it's meaningless. Because if it is there for the purpose, and the purpose is that there should be a nice wedding, then it has purpose, it has meaning. But if the main focal point is not there, then it loses everything. Similarly here, all of the worlds that are above us in the Garden of Eden and on all the levels are only because of us. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Leadi writes in Tanya, and he says that the only reason that all of these worlds were created is for the soul to descend in the body, and that the body should actually do the physical mitzvah. And all of the souls and all of the angels watch us constantly to see how we're doing it, because if we do it, they have an elevation. If we don't do it, then I don't want to talk what happens. So the point of the matter is that in Judaism, the value is tremendously put on living in this world. And that's where people come with the concept that Judaism is all about life here, not about the world to come. But the truth of the matter is that they're both true. And the question is, how do we bring this together? It's a dichotomy. You know the famous story of a rabbi that was listening to litigants in his study at home, and he listened to the arguments, and after the first guy finished his argument, he says, you know what, you make a very compelling case, I think you're right. So the second guy says, you haven't heard my side, here's my side of the story. And he finishes his argument, and the rabbi says, you make an equally compelling argument, I think you're right. So his wife runs in and says, how can they both be right? And he says, you know what, you're also right. So the point of the matter is, how do we deal with this seeming contradiction? Furthermore, if you give a look on the Mishnah that I mentioned before, it actually becomes even more more complex. If you look at text 10, so it says in the Mishnah, against your will you were formed, and against your will you were born. Then it says, against your will you live, and against your will you die. What is he talking about here? So we have already learned what it means that against your will you're born. That the soul doesn't want to descend into the body. The soul wants to live in heaven. That we understand. But why is it against the will you die? If you're already longing to come back to heaven because that's your place, so you should look forward to dying. And in fact, those religions that believe in that, so they celebrate martyrdom. The same religion that we said before, that they scold people that are in mourning, they celebrate martyrdom. Why do they celebrate martyrdom? Because the ultimate of life is to go upstairs, to be in heaven. And if you're doing it in a way that your life is taken away from you, it's even greater. In Judaism, the only time that we say that when someone gave their life, they're holy, we say it, but we cry about it. So the Jews that perish because they were oppressed and tortured, for Jews, we say they're the holiest soul. But do we want it to happen? Do we celebrate them? Absolutely not. We cry. Why? Because we want them to live. The soul itself wants to live. Not only that, is an interesting thing that it says in Kabbalah, that when a person dies and the family is grieving and crying, and then all the people that come to the funeral and to the cemetery are crying, the soul cries with them as well, because the soul became attached to the body, and the soul doesn't want to leave the body, and the soul feels bad that it's leaving the body. So the soul is also in a mourning kind of situation. And in fact, there are very strict laws of how we conduct ourselves in front of a body when the body is being prepared for burial and when the body is at the cemetery. There's no jesting or joking. And it's even if the relatives are not there, let's say it's a person that has no relatives, or during the time of COVID now, when there are restrictions and you can't have people come to the cemetery, and you just have either the cemetery staff or the rabbi there. So everybody has to be in a very careful mode. Why? Because the soul is still hovering over the body and the soul is in mourning. Why? Because it's against the will of the soul to die. The soul wants to live. And if the soul wants to live, so therefore it's crying that it died. So the question is, how does that jive when you say that at the beginning, it doesn't want to come into the body? And then when it comes into the body, now you say it doesn't want to leave the body. Which way is it? So we're going to go to this. We're going to go to this question with two ways. One is going to be in a simple way, and the other one is going to be in a deeper way. The deeper way I'm going to leave for last, but I want to bring it out in a more simple concept. And that is, and I know that I'm oversimplifying it, so I ask for forgiveness that I'm oversimplifying it, but I think that using this approach will give us a little bit of a better idea. Take, for instance, someone that you have a child, and the child is growing up, and you're teaching the child music, or you're teaching the child how to sing, or you're teaching the child how to act, or how to do a sport, whatever it is. And they have stage fright, and they feel more comfortable being at home, singing alone in the house, and or playing sports in the backyard with friends, but not being out there in a stadium where everyone is watching them, or going to an auditorium to play the musical instrument where everybody can hear them, because over there they're very nervous, they have stage fright. So you work with them and you work with them and you try to tell them, listen, it's okay. You'll be. I remember as a child, when I was becoming bar mitzvah, my biggest fear was that I had to recite a discourse in Hasidic thought by heart, and then I had to give a concept in halacha in front of all my friends, peers, and adults. And I was so nervous about it. And everybody was trying to tell me how I should do it. Think that you're speaking in front of empty chairs. Think that people are not actually listening, all kinds of gimmicks. But it didn't help, because at the end of the day, you're there and you have an audience of 300 people, and they're listening to and watching you. And if you make a mistake and you fall, so everybody will know that. So it's very nerve-wracking. However, once the child or the young adult or the person overcomes their stage fright and they get used to it, they actually get a thrill out of it. So if you have someone that really is good in what they're doing, and they develop the skill and they sharpen it, and they refine it, and then they're doing well. So even if they make a mistake here or there, but by and large, they're doing something fantastic, and they get a thrill when people are inspired by them, and they like the fact that there is an applause. Similarly, when you have a sports athlete who may strike out in baseball and the batting average is only 300, but when he does hit the home run, or he hits the score, the game-winning double, that brings his team to victory, there's this huge thrill that's there. And then all of a sudden you tell him, you know what? You're out of the major leagues. We decided that we're going to replace you. You go play baseball at home. It's a letdown, right? The same thing as if someone is performing and they're doing well, and you say to them, we don't need you anymore. So it's a letdown. So on a simple level, the soul has gotten the thrill of living a good life, living an ethical life, doing Torah, doing mitzvahs, and fulfilling its mission, and it finally got comfortable to it, and all of a sudden, the angel comes along and says, it's time for you to come back. It's time for you to leave here. So for that reason, it says, against your will, you die. So this doesn't answer the question. What we're trying to do here is to try to figure out how you drive these two attitudes, and what is our true attitude to life and to death. This is very important, because there's a famous story in the Talmud where someone was asked, a great rabbi was asked about the merrymaking, and he says, let me ask you, did you have a child? He says, yes. How did you feel when the child was born? He says, I was elated. I danced. He says, how could you dance that the child was born? Don't you know that nobody is immortal, and the child will eventually grow up and die? So why are you not crying about the death? He says, now's the time to dance, and then it will be the time to mourn. So people put it into perspective. But in Judaism, we have to see more than that. In other words, what is actually expected from us? On the one hand, we say that the soul is the main thing and the body is secondary. So therefore, when someone dies, the soul doesn't cease to exist. It continues on. And not only that, it receives the reward for everything that is done in this world, and therefore it goes higher. So here's the philosophy that's developed. But I'm not yet to the third point. So the deeper point is actually going to be above that. But I still want to explain it according to this philosophy. And this is the philosophy that most Jews have. The philosophy that most Jews have that study Judaism is the following: that it is true that the soul is the most important, and the soul is the highest thing, and the soul is what aspires to be spiritual and wants to be with God. But because the soul has descended to earth, and the soul lives in a body, and the soul fulfills its mission, so we try to prolong it as much as possible. And not only that, according to Judaism, you have to do everything you can to preserve life. For that reason, if someone is sick, someone is ill, they need to go to a doctor, get treatment. Of course, they have to pray, but that's not enough. The Torah says, in not this week's portion, but the portion after that, V'rape yerape, that in a few portions, that the doctor says, so you have to heal, you have to go to the physician to heal. And if there's a pandemic and they come up with a way to help you, and I'm not going into the vaccine or not vaccine, but the vaccine is being proven each and every day that it's effective. So the logical thing is to try to take it, to be able to prolong life. And that's why we don't spare anything to try to save life. We try to get to the best physician. If somebody is in danger of death, we will turn over every stone in order to see that they should live. And if they die, we weep. But on the other hand, we don't think it's the end. Here's an interesting story from the Gemara. Before we go to the interesting story from the Gemara, I want to bring up a story that happened with Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Shares. Now, I know that in the JLI, they talk a lot about the thanatophobia, which is about the fear of death. The reason that I am not addressing that is I really believe in talking to a lot of people, that people are not afraid of dying. They are afraid of the unknown. I remember I was counseling a woman who was in her 50s, and she was dying from cancer here in Charlotte. And I met with her. She was close to us. I met with her a few days before she passed away, and I asked her, what's going through your mind? And she said, fear. I said, fear of what? Fear of dying? She said, fear of the unknown, fear of where am I going from here? The fear of what? So I said, describe it to me. So she said, it's like, I feel like I'm going to be dropped down into an endless dark tunnel and not knowing what awaits me there. So that's a legitimate kind of feeling that a person has because they don't know. So I said, let us study a little bit of the Kabbalah and the Zohar and see what it says in Jewish sources of what happens during the time of the transition. And during the time of the transition, actually, there's something spectacular that happens. And I told her a story that I heard from my grandmother, who was in the city of Hebron. The city of Hebron was a very Jewish city going back until 1922, when there were the big pogroms. But she had a grandmother who was a very pious woman who was on her deathbed, and she actually was declared clinically dead, but they didn't move her yet. And a few hours later, she came back to herself, and her face was totally radiant. And the family asked her, what did you see? She says, I can't tell you, but it was very bright and warm and very, very embracing. And she lived for another 2 days, and then she passed away. So I told it to this lady. So the idea is that when one knows that according to Judaism, the transition is not as fearful as some people think, but actually it's a transition that brings the person to a very warm and accepting and receiving place, it takes away the fear. So that's why I'm not talking about the fear. I want to talk about what the emphasis is. What's the emphasis? That in order for us to understand death, we have to understand what life is. The statement that was made before, v'chai behem, that you should live in it, is something which is a cornerstone. It's a foundational idea in a foundational platform in Judaism that we have to do everything that we could live. So now we're going to go to the third dimension. And in order to go to the third dimension, which I mentioned right in the beginning, we're going to see a few stories and texts. It's mostly stories. But
Rabbi,
really...
I have a quick question.
Sure.
I was wondering, why is it that the soul is what gets the reward if it's the body that has to yield to the soul's wishes? Like the soul, the neshama is already holy, and it has to be the body has to yield to the soul. So if the soul is then the one that's yielding its wishes, should it not get the reward?
Okay, so I'm going to repeat the question for the benefit of everybody. You're saying, why is it that the soul should get the reward when really the soul has a desire to fulfill what God wants? And the body is the one that's yielding to the soul. Shouldn't the body get the reward? That question is a very powerful question. And the reason that it's a very powerful question goes to the very heart of what we're discussing. And let me explain it briefly. Here's what I want to explain briefly. Logically speaking, when you think about the composition of the human being, and you think that the body is a garment, so it's only a tool through which the soul can live and do what it has to do, but it has no life of its own. Maimonides is of that opinion. That's why Maimonides says that the ultimate reward is the reward of the soul in heaven. And the body doesn't know if it came or it didn't come. The body is just a garment. It's as if you're wearing a suit or a dress, and the suit and the dress got you all the compliments. Are you later going to go and caress the suit and say, you're such a good suit, I like you? Because the suit is just a suit. It's not anything else. So for that reason, since the soul, and here's another thing, according to Maimonides, the soul, once it enters into the body and it interfaces with the body, and it begins to acquire the taste that the body has, it could easily yield to the body. It could easily fall to the temptations of the body. So the challenge is really for the soul to dominate the body. And for that reason, it receives the reward. The Medrash also says that the ultimate purpose of the descent of the soul in the body is that the soul should be able to have an elevation, that the soul should be able to elevate. How's the soul elevated? When it faces all these challenges and these temptations in the physical world, and yet is able to transform the physical into something spiritual, so then it has its elevation. That's Maimonides' view. Nachmanides, who came just after Maimonides and also lived in Spain, says that that's true, what Maimonides says, but it's only on one level. There's a much deeper level, and that is that the body actually does receive the reward for the very reason that you said it. And not only that, but he claims that the source of the body, going on Kabbalah, actually is even higher than the source of the soul. And right now we don't have the time to talk about it. Maybe at the end we'll explain it, why the body's source is even greater than the source of the soul. And for that reason, he says, quoting Kabbalah, that the ultimate reward is the resurrection of the dead. Maimonides also speaks about the resurrection of the dead, but he doesn't argue. He argues that that's not the ultimate reward. Nachmanides argues that the resurrection of the dead, which means that the bodies actually come back to life, that is when the ultimate reward will be there, because of the fact that the body developed itself and it worked together with the soul, and it did the self-denial. So therefore, it will receive the ultimate reward, which would be even the greater than the reward than the soul. So that's a very, very good question.
Thank you.
By the way, anyone that has any other questions, please feel free to ask. And yes.
What about the concept that animals have pieces of souls?
That what?
That animals have pieces of souls.
Pieces?
Yeah.
Animals have certain kind of souls, but because the animals were created different than the humans, we don't say that the animal soul actually is eternal like the human soul. It goes back, it's reconsumed in its source where it came from. Very, very different than a human soul. The human soul is an entity that preceded the body. It was before the body was born, so therefore it was there before. It goes through its journey and then it ascends above. The animal also is extracted from the word of God, but when it dies, it goes back into its source. It doesn't remain as an entity unto itself. So, and it's not true with only with animals, it's true with everything that's created in the world. The humans are the only ones that are distinct, that when you speak about the eternity of the soul, it's the eternity of the soul because the soul preceded the body. And maybe I should have made that point a little earlier, because when I showed the PowerPoint of the difference of the creation of the human to the creation of the animal, the fact of the matter is that the way the animal was created is when God said, let there be this particular animal, and it was with the various letters of God, the soul and the body came simultaneously. And once the body dies, the soul doesn't stop existing, but it retrieves and enters back, so to speak, in the words that created it. But the soul was created as a separate entity from the beginning, and it lived in the chamber of the souls. So then when it leaves the body, it goes back to the chamber, it goes back to a higher chamber, but it stays in its eternity. So we have to be very clear about that. It's, God forbid, nothing against animals, but animals are part of nature, and they don't have the mission that human beings. That's why animals were not given the freedom of choice. Animals don't have freedom of choice.
Well, somebody once told me that pieces of people's souls can sometimes finish up work they have left to do via animals.
Okay, so you're talking about something which is a little different. That's reincarnation, which we're going to talk about that when we come to the section of reincarnation. So just to explain what you're saying is that sometimes a soul, if it didn't act properly in this world, it could sort of go through an exile. And the exile is that it enters into the body of the animal. And when it enters into the body of the animal, it suffers and it has to go through a whole journey. But because it's a human soul, it doesn't become an animal. It still remains a human cloaked in an animal body. And therefore, when that animal dies, the soul goes back to wherever souls are in that process. So we have to distinguish between the two. Okay? Very good. Very good questions.
Rabbi,
Yes.
one question. When in Judaism, when do we believe that the soul is into the body? In other words, is it at the time of conception or is it the time of birth?
Okay, I wasn't going to talk much about that because that goes into a lot of other stuff. But since you brought it up, I definitely do want to answer that, at least briefly. And that is that at the time of conception, or at least 40 days after conception, the soul is assigned to that particular body. But it doesn't mean that it actually enters into the body. It's already assigned to that body and it has a connection to the body, but it enters into the body at the time of birth. And because it enters into the time of the body at the time of birth, that's why we celebrate the birthday. We don't celebrate the conception day, we celebrate the birthday, because the birthday is the time that the soul enters and it becomes an independent being. But even then, the soul is not totally bonding with the body. The soul starts to bond with the body when the name is given, when the Hebrew name is given. The Hebrew name is the conduit through which the soul could connect with the body. For that reason, there's a custom, and it's true in Chabad. So when it comes to a boy, we want to have the two mitzvahs together. So the naming is always done at the time of the bris, of the circumcision. But by a girl in Chabad, the custom is that the Hebrew name is given at the first opportunity when there's a Torah reading. Why? Because you want to bring the soul into the body. But sometimes if the bris is delayed, I had a case with one of our children that the little boy was jaundiced, and the mohel said it's too early to do the bris. It was the 8th day. He said, no, we have to wait and wait. And my wife and I wrote a note to the Rebbe asking the Rebbe for the blessing. This was in the 80s. And the Rebbe told my father that he should call us up and tell us that we should decide in a definitive way what the baby's Hebrew name will be, even though we won't call him by that, but just by us making the decision and knowing that and thinking about him in that way, that will already give him the energy and give him the life. And as soon as we did it, the Billy Rubin numbers started going down. And it was very interesting because we were still not settled. I had one name that was a favorite. She had a different name. And of course, I gave in to her and we decided on her name. And sure enough, the jaundice went down. So that's another level of when the soul bonds. Then when a girl turns bat mitzvah and a boy turns bar mitzvah, it bonds even more. Then that's when it becomes complete. So it's different stages, but it's a very good question. But generally, we say that the soul is assigned to the particular body 40 days after conception, but it enters into the body at the time of birth. Okay, we'll take some more questions soon. So I want to go into this third dimension. We're going to go into text 11. Text 11 is going to bring out a concept which brings out the uniqueness of the Jewish perspective and why it's different than all the other religious perspectives, by saying that it's not that the soul is the main thing, so therefore we're not afraid of death. It's just a different kind of existence. It's one kind of life when the person is living in this body, and then there's another kind of life when it goes out of the body. How do we get to that? This is the main crux of the class. So this particular point from now on gives you now the unique Jewish perspective. This is very, very important. So let's look at text 11. Text 11 is about the previous Rebbe. The previous Rebbe was the Rebbe's father-in-law, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. He was the 6th Rebbe of Lubavitch, and in 1927, he was arrested by the Soviet authorities because he was accused of being the biggest troublemaker because he was promoting Judaism. And that's when the GPU, they were the predecessor of the NKVD, which was the predecessor of the KGB, came to him and arrested him. And it's all been documented and recorded and spoken about. And he himself wrote it in his own memoirs. And he writes the following: I arrived for interrogation at the offices of the Soviet Union. I'm sorry, I'm just getting to him. Oops. There we go. I arrived, he says, for interrogation at the offices of the Soviet GPU, that's the KGB. However, in keeping with my principles, I was not very cooperative. In other words, he made a decision when they arrested him that he is not bound by them whatsoever. He's not going to fall for them. He's not going to be intimidated by them, no matter what they threaten him with. And he also said that everything is by divine providence. God leads the way, and he just has to be focused on what his mission is. And we have to understand that when he describes what it was like to be brought into that big prison to the interrogation room, they would take them through these long corridors, and it was very dark, and there were guards standing there with rifles and guns, very strict, and they would deliberately pass them through the torture chambers so they can hear prisoners being tortured and scream for their life, just to intimidate him. So when he gets to the interrogation room, so he should cooperate with them. And they wanted to have information from him. So he says, you hear this? One of the interrogators raised the revolver that sat on the desk before him. He looked me in the eye and mockingly said, this small toy has incredible powers. It causes principles to melt away. It opens mouths. Under its spell, even mutes have become talkative. The previous Rebbe was very calm and cool and collected, and he responded, you're quite mistaken. That toy only has an effect on the faint-hearted non-believers, those with one world and multiple gods. We're not talking about gods because they were atheists, but multiple ideals. We, on the other hand, have one God and two worlds. As much as I don't panic at the sight of your toy, as it has no effect on me whatsoever. There's no question that the Rebbe wanted to live. There's no question that he didn't want to give his life away. But at the same time, he was able to transcend that. He wasn't afraid of death. He wasn't afraid of anything that they'll do to him because he believed that there's something much more valuable, which was the principles that he believed in, the principles of Judaism. Now, we don't understand this story well, because if you read the story on the surface, it means just like any other religious leader, any other religious person would say, I have more than one life to live. You kill me here, I have the world to come to live in. And that's what the other religions say. But we're going to soon see that this is not what this is about. And this is where I need you to pay attention and follow me on this, because this is the most important part. We come to a story here with Rebbe. Who was Rebbe? Rebbe was Rabbi Judah the Prince. Rabbi Judah the Prince was the author of the Mishnah. He was one of the most influential Jews in after the time of the destruction of the temple. He lived a full life, and he was wealthy. He supported the poor. He, as I said, he was intellectual. He authored the Mishnah. So the Talmud in Ksubas tells the following story. When Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, fell ill, and lay on his deathbed, his student Rabbi Chia entered and found him weeping. My master, exclaimed Rabbi Chia, why do you weep? Was it not taught if one dies smiling, it is a good sign for him, while weeping is a bad sign for him? So Rabbi Yehuda replied, I weep because of my inability to study Torah and observe the commandments after death. Now, let me ask you a simple question. If you were visiting someone that you respected, and they were on their deathbed, and they were crying, would you ask them why you're crying? I mean, it's self-understood why they're crying. They're about to die. Rabbi Chia asked this question. Why is he asking this question? Because obviously he understood something which was much deeper. And not only did he understand that it's much deeper, but he was actually surprised why Rebbe was crying when he understood that everything that Rebbe accomplished and everything that he did, he is now going to be transitioning into the higher world. And what was Rebbe's answer? He says, I'm not afraid of dying. I'm not afraid of what's going to await me, but I recognize the value of what can be accomplished in this world, which cannot be accomplished in the world to come, and I'm going to miss this terribly. So what does this mean? Here's where I want to get to the crux of it. And follow me with that. The Talmud makes a statement and says that the tzaddikim, the righteous, even after they die, they're alive. What does it mean after they die, they're alive? And then it makes another statement, which is not mentioned here, so I shouldn't really say it, but I'm going to say it anyways. It says the wicked, when they're alive, they're dead as well. What's the meaning of that? And this is something that we really need to explore, because this is something which really takes the whole crux of what we're talking about here. Okay. So how are we going to say it and be able to express it? This is what it is. If you compare the soul to the body, if you compare the life of the soul to the life of the body, which one do you consider to be alive and which one do you consider to be not alive? Obviously, everything that's connected to the soul is full of life. That's what life is. Life is connected to the source. Life is a vivaciousness. Life is a spirit. Life is something that is holy. That's what life is. Death is the opposite. Death is the physical. Death is the materialistic. Why? Because as we're soon going to see a reading from the Rebbe Rashab, materialism doesn't have a lasting value. It decays from the moment it comes into existence. Something which is spiritual and godly is eternal. What is the life of a tzaddik? The life of a tzaddik is not the life of a regular person. The life of a tzaddik, as we will give a look in text 14 from the Alter Rebbe, he says, it's on page 19, the life of a tzaddik, of a righteous person, is not the corporal but spiritual, consisting of faith, reverence, love of God. This reality is reflected in the passage. We'll get to that soon. In order to explain it, I have to go back to explain the relationship between the body and the soul. There are three kinds of relationships. And this kind of relationship can exist in marriage, it can exist among partners, it can exist anywhere. The Rebbe Rashab explains it in a specific discourse. You can have a marriage or a relationship with one side is dominant, and that side that's dominant is the most powerful. So you can have a relationship where the soul is dominant and the body is nothing. And in order to make sure that the body is nothing, you put the body down and you say the body has no value whatsoever. These are people that try to live an ascetic life. They try to live a very high spiritual life. And not only that, they deny the body anything that the body needs because they want that the body should be totally subservient to the soul. And they see this as holiness. It's a famous story with one of the Hasidic Rebbes, the Chozeh of Lublin, that after the Rosh Hashanah service, he told any of his students that if you come to me, I will put my hand on your head. I will know what you prayed for, and I'll know what your answer was. And nobody was bold enough and audacious enough to come over to him to do it, except there was one student. And the Rebbe put his hand on the forehead of this student, and he thought, and he consciously says, I know what you asked for. You asked that one day a week you shall work and to be able to earn enough money to provide for your livelihood for the rest of the week. So the rest of the week you can pray and you can study and be involved in spirituality. And the rabbi said, you're exactly right, the student said. And he said, what was the answer? He says, God said, for that I didn't have to create you. I could have kept you in heaven. I created you that you should be involved in the world and engaged in the world and that you should do Torah and mitzvahs. And when you're in work, you're elevating the world. So you can have people that their whole relationship with the body is that the body becomes totally subservient and they live on a very spiritual high level. And those people are not afraid of dying because everything is about spirituality. Then you can have on the other extreme, people that their relationship with the body is the opposite. The body dominates. And life is all about how many physical pleasures I can take. I have a bucket list. And my bucket list is I have to experience this, I have to experience that. I have to travel to this country and to that country. I have to taste all kinds of foods. I have to have all kinds of physical sensations. And then I feel that I'm totally fulfilled. I'm fulfilled because I've eaten so many different kinds of foods. I've had so many different kinds of wines. I listen to all this kind of music. I work for a living, but my purpose in living is that my body should really feel good. I feel elated by that. Okay, so that kind of person, the soul is really in exile because the soul is non-existent and the body is dominant. That's the side where it's not real life. It's all about the material. Then there is a relationship that transcends it altogether. The relationship that transcends it is that there's a harmony between the body and the soul. What does it mean that there's a harmony between the body and the soul? The soul recognizes the value of the body as much as the body recognizes the value of the soul. The body recognizing the value of the soul is because the body realizes that it's corporal, that it's tangible, that it's physical, and it's material, and it has no real high purpose to it. So therefore it needs the soul because the soul gives it its content and its meaning. But the soul, on the other hand, recognizes that if not for the body, he would not be able to do the Torah mitzvahs. The body is where the desire is. Such people that live on that level, they're already living in the world to come. They're already living in the hereafter. In other words, the world is not an obstruction to them. The world is a prism through which they're able to see the higher light. If we go back to the story of the previous Rebbe, it wasn't that he said, I'm not afraid of the revolver because I'm not afraid of dying because I can go to the next world. That's not what he said at all. The next world is now. I'm already living in that world, but I'm living that world here. I'm living the higher world here through my body. And that's a very, very high level. Most of us can't live on that level. Most of us can't live on that level that we become so holy. Like there's a verse that says, Olam chatir b'chayecha, that your Olam haba, the world to come, you already experience it in this world. What does that mean? You're leading such a life that the physical is in total harmony with the spiritual, and it's not an obstruction to it. It's so refined that it's not an obstruction to it. But we're talking about normal people. And that's why I want you to look at the slide that we have up right now. The slide that we have up right now is talking about average people. The average people is the following. What part of us is eternal is our spiritual identity. The spiritual identity that we have now, that's what's eternal. That's everlasting. The physical pursuits, that dies with us when our death comes. So when we say that we're still living even after death, it's our spiritual entity that's living. Some people live and they say, I want to die only after I leave a legacy. I want to die only after I've accomplished something that people will remember me. And if people remember me, then it was worth living. What we're saying, it's not about that. Of course, you should do good things and inspire people, but it's not about remembering you. Your spiritual aspect that you have within yourself, that's eternal, that never dies. The Torah that you study, the mitzvahs that you do, the tzedakah that you give, the higher experiences that you have, that which you're living right now is your world to come, and that never ceases to exist. When you're talking about a tzaddik on the highest level, they don't have any physical pursuits. They don't have any materialism. But us average people, we do have that. We have a part of us that's very physical, and we have a part of us that's very spiritual. So in Judaism, what Judaism says is, yeah, there is death. The physical stops living, but the spiritual is eternal. And because the spiritual is eternal, so therefore, that never dies. And that continues to live. And that continues to live, whether it's in a body or outside of body, it's the same thing. Because the body is not what determines that level of life. When you're alive and you're in a body, so then you can do the physical mitzvahs. Not, you're still living a spiritual life. And that is the attitude. That gives us the balance here to try to understand it. And I want to just read one more reading and then open it up to questions. And this reading actually encapsulates it all together. It's on page 20. So there's a verse that Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Jewish people, and he says, behold, I set before you today, it's like a choice, the life and goodness, and then there's the opposite of life, and I'm asking you to choose life. The term life in this verse does not refer to corporal life, nor does death refer to the result of the soul's departure, for which simpleton needs to be instructed to choose to live. A very simple thing. If somebody is told this path will give you life and that path will give you death, I don't have to tell him choose life. Of course they'll choose life. So what is he talking about here? So he says, rather, each creation, while alive and fully existent, contains both life and death. The physicality of the object is intrinsically lifeless. It is in a constant state of decline and deterioration. We observe this decline in every physical object, as well as in ourselves. Our physical capabilities and powers weaken with time. By contrast, the spiritual and the divine within each thing is alive, eternal, and not subject to destruction or deterioration, God forbid. What is this saying? The food you're eating and enjoying, that's temporary. It doesn't last forever. The basking in the sun on the beach, that's nice for the body, but it doesn't last forever. The spiritual things and the godly things and the mitzvahs that you're doing, that is life that lasts forever. So when we're talking about choose life, it's not saying that or death is not talking about later, it's talking about now. It's talking about now, right now, as we are. There's a part of us that's alive and there's a part of us that's not alive. So when we are talking about life, there are already these two elements of life and death. So when there is the death, that doesn't change that existence. Just like when we're alive, there's a part of us that's considered dead because it's material, and the soul is considered alive. So when we die, that's a continuation of that. It's not that it's a change of pace, it's a continuation. The only thing that's different is that until the moment of death, we have the ability to do mitzvahs and to accomplish. And after we leave, then we start receiving a deeper level of reward. We're able to see it in a spiritual thing. We're no longer obstructed by the body. So now this gives us a much better perspective, a balanced way on how to look. Let's take it down to practicality. If you ask a Jewish person, would you rather live a life of spirituality, which means that the only way you can achieve that is by dying? A Jew would say, absolutely not. I want to live as much as possible because I want to be able to have the opportunity to fulfill God's mission and to do the mitzvahs. A Jew is not going to say, I want to live another week and another 2 weeks because I want to have another tasty challah or gefilte fish or chont. That's not a Jewish response. The Jewish response is, I want to live because I want to do another mitzvah. But on the other hand, if the time has come that I have to go, so then I try to prolong it, but if I know there's no choice, I just go, and I know that I'm going into that existence of eternal life. So therefore, I'm not afraid of it. I'm not fearing it. But what it does compel me to do is that while I'm alive, I want to have that eternal life now. It helps me make my choices. So if I have a spare moment and I could use it to live the spiritual life versus doing the physical stuff, that's just a waste of time, I say it's not worth it, because that's death. That's something that doesn't bring anything to me. The spirituality and the godliness, that does.